Are we headed toward a recession? It seems to be the talk of every presidential debate now, and it's a question on almost all of our minds. What is the market doing? How well are we doing? And are we headed toward a recession? Gordon Denlinger, the state director of the NFIB here in Pennsylvania, joins us to break down those questions. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm your host, Sam Chen. Are we headed toward a recession? It's a question that we're constantly asking, and if you've tuned in to the 2020 presidential debates, it's a question that candidates are asking too. But what is a recession? What are the markers of the recession? And what do the current markers in our economy tell us about where we're headed? Gordon Denlinger, the state director of the National Federation for Independent Business here in Pennsylvania, as well as a former state representative in our legislature, joins us to break down those questions. Gordon, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for coming back in and for joining us.
Thank you, Sam. Always great to be with you.
Always a pleasure to have you here. Let's start with the 30,000 foot level, as we always do. Recession, you hear about it, I hear about it, it's on everyone's minds. And it's not something that really goes away. There's always the fear of going back to a recession. We know it's cyclical, and there's a lot of talk right now among our presidential candidates about whether or not we're headed toward one in the upcoming near future. So let's just define the terms. When we say recession, what are we talking about?
Well, recession, defined technically, is a series of 8 quarters in which you would see a decline in GDP. So the economy contracting as a whole over a set period of time is the technical definition of a recession. Going into it, you'll have weak quarters, lack of growth. Coming out of it, we limp out of them typically. That is contrasted with the Depression, which we last experienced in the 1930s, of course. And there is a much deeper trough, a much more extended period of decline of the GDP. More commonly, the expressions used in a recession, your neighbor loses his job. In a depression, you've lost yours.
Right.
So it all comes down to severity of an economic downturn.
And if I remember correctly, not that I was alive at the time, but in 1980, in that famous presidential debate between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, if I remember my history correctly, Reagan quips a recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose yours, and the recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his. I believe
Yes.
it was that famous quip. Let me ask you, recession, depression. We talked about 8 quarters, consecutive quarters, each quarter being 3 months. Then, correct? The quarter of the year.
Correct.
So we're looking at two years where the economy is contracting, where growth was really not happening. At that point, they ruled this a recession.
Correct.
What are the markers of that? When we talk about growth, what are we looking at? So what constitutes a growing economy versus one that's contracting? What are they looking for?
Expansions driven by economic activity, and that is measured in a number of different ways. But total economic output is the word. And that would be a measurement of manufacturing productivity, sales, these kinds of things that in employment certainly enters into it. So there's a range of factors that equate into whether the economy is growing or not. But as you say, recessions are cyclical. The economy rides up, rides down. This has been going on, for extended periods of time, somewhat stabilized by the Federal Reserve System, but still in all economies ride up and ride down. And we've been in a historically long expansion period at this point. We limped our way out of the, quote, Great Recession, end quote, of 2008. The question now is, has this expansion run its course or not?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I gather that not every recession is as severe as 2008.
Absolutely. There are a number of more minor ones. There was one in 1992. Coming at the end of the Bush 41 presidency, which frankly helped Bill Clinton to achieve the presidency. There was one at the end of the tech bubble, the 1999, 2000, kind of into that time frame. So yes, there can be more minor ones. Of course, the Great Recession is about as deep as one can get before you'd classify it as a depression.
We talk about the markers. Excuse me. We talk about the markers of recession. But what are the signs that the public can look toward? How do they know recession's coming?
Well, there's different things you'll hear. Within the banking space, people talk about the inverted yield curve. And what that means is typically the longer term a financial instrument has, the higher the rate of interest it should generate. We're currently in an inverted yield curve situation where the 30-year bond is drawing less in interest than what shorter term treasury notes would draw. Something's upside down in that equation. That tends to be a canary in the coal mine, if you will, that a recession might be coming. The thing that I think most look to is, are there bubbles in the economy? Okay. Coming into '08, clearly real estate was in a bubble scenario. Something had gone out of control in the real estate space. In this economy, quite frankly, we see very few things would be called bubbles. The markets are valued pretty highly, but is any particular sector out of line? And the answer is really no, not at this point.
So how would you define a bubble in that sense? Talk about the real estate bubble in '08. Excuse me. Talk about the real estate bubble in '08. Everyone knew that was there. But what is a bubble? How do we tell if there are bubbles today in the economy? How will we know when we see one?
Some sector gets way out of whack in its valuation, and it becomes the Wild West. You think about the tech bubble of the late 1990s, when tech stocks just were like shooting through the roof like crazy, without value being built in the companies underneath those valuations. Real estate, same way. The secondary mortgage market, which was, of course, the root cause of the collapse there. Folks were speculating in that space just in ridiculous ways. You look at the current market lineup, and of course, all the sectors: auto, tech, electronics, airlines, all of the rest of it, defense. There doesn't seem to be one that you would say, wow, valuations are not aligning with the growth of the corporations underneath them. So we do not seem to have a bubble at this point.
So was the real estate bubble in 2008, was that the only thing that drove it? Or what happened leading up to 2008 that made that not just a recession, but to your point, it was probably one of the worst ones that we've had recession-wise in recent, at least in recent history. What led up to that? What made '08 so bad?
Sure, there were clear patterns of corruption underneath that, tied to bundling of mortgages that were non-performing and selling them secondarily. Clearly the removal of the standards that people would use to apply for mortgages, the percentages down, employment histories, financial stability were thrown out the window. They were giving mortgages to people that never should have had them, frankly, and the end of it was just a lot of corrupt mess, quite frankly. The thing that concerns me a little is, following that, Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Fed at that point, knew to flood the capital markets with cash, and he did, and he prevented the Great Recession from becoming the Great Depression all over again.
Sure.
But the mantra after that was, you bailed out Wall Street, you didn't bail out Main Street. So Congress, under President Obama and the Democratic majorities, basically have put in statute prohibitions on the Federal Reserve doing what it did to prevent a further collapse. You can say, well, then they won't be propping up some of the Wall Street financial houses again. Okay, but that's what prevented a more massive collapse. So that's where we're sitting today. The Fed Reserve has very few tools in its tool chest to prevent a more significant collapse.
The other thing the federal government did was they also put into play certain rules. And we could argue if these rules are good ideas. I'm thinking, for example, Reg Z in the banking industry, which forced them on a waiting period timetable to turn around mortgages and loans, things like that. You mentioned recessions are cyclical. So one is eventually going to happen at some point.
Yep.
Do you expect it to be as bad as the one in '08?
Well, the variables, again, is there a bubble that explodes? I don't see that. It would seem to be, if we go into one, it would be a more soft landing, as they say.
Sure.
The prevention of the Fed from intervening in the economy, as has been, as I mentioned, has been prevented by statute, may deepen it. It may cause it to be more severe.
Than it otherwise would be.
We'll have to see. Yeah.
Let's start down this road. We'll take a break and we'll come back to it. But I want to start here asking you. You work for the National Federation of Independent Business, specifically here in Pennsylvania. Large companies tend to survive recessions, right? I mean, they're large. They have the bandwidth to do it. Where a lot of people get concerned is with their small businesses, guys that you represent. How does a recession affect one of your members, an independent business, a small business, a mom and pop shop?
Sure, and I appreciate that question. It comes down to capitalization. It comes down to the strength of reserves on the balance sheet, durability of product line.
Sure.
Some things we'll just say our members who are in the funeral business are probably going to keep on rolling. They do that. Folks,
some things never change.
Some things, you get into discretionary products, the cup of coffee that costs $3, folks might say, I'm not sure I need that.
Sure.
We're tightening up the belt, we're hunkering down a little bit. So a lot of it's industry specific, but ultimately it does tend to hit the smalls a little bit harder than the bigs.
Sure. That's I appreciate that perspective. Gordon, don't go away. When we come back, I want to talk about whether or not we are actually headed to a recession right now, as a lot of people seem to think we are. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Gordon, let's just pick up where we left off, talking about recession and how a recession impacts a small business. And to your point, you said it kind of depends on what kind of business we're looking at. There are some things people are going to need no matter what. Funeral homes, plumbers, things like this. The other service industry jobs, for example, small coffee shops, those things can be really impacted sometimes by a recession. There's a lot of talk right now that we're headed toward a recession. And you hear this in the presidential debates. There's also economists who are looking at the Trump administration right now and wondering if he's hedging his bets against potentially a recession. We know recessions are cyclical. We know there's no way you avoid one your entire life. But from your perspective, where are we headed right now in the economy? What's the level of concern about the recession?
One advantage that I have as state director of NFIB is we're tied to an amazing economics shop, and that's connected to George Mason University and the Mercatus Center. And for 45 years, NFIB's put out its Optimism Index, which is a measure of small business owners out across the nation. 10 different metrics, 5 which are future looking, 5 which are current situations. And this is about sales, plans to hire, capital outlays, inventory, all the rest of it. And at this point, small business owners are, I will say, solid where they are, but growing a little more concerned about where we're going to be 6 months down the road. That's the sort of the feeling that you get. But I do wonder, to your point, how much of the concern is being driven by, are we talking ourselves into a recession versus the reality? I will say that business owners are experiencing really an unprecedented level of profitability. The big number one problem, can't find people, workforce issues is still number one. The economy keeps buzzing along. And so being in election season, I think we all have to take a little bit of a step back and say, am I being talked into the bad news, or is it really happening? Access to capital is strong. Can't find enough people, so hiring, the unemployment is still very strong. Inflation is nil. We're at that point. Just so many good things that would indicate good time to continue expanding, growing, and making some investments.
So the current metrics look good. It's 6 months out that there's some fear among business owners about what's to come.
Yes.
Let me ask you about that. You mentioned the idea of speculation. That's a big debate. How much does speculation impact our economy, impact the job markets? Obviously, there are real metrics we're looking at when it gets to a booming market versus a recession. We talked about some of those metrics, right? If the market is not performing well, if it's contracting for 8 straight quarters, we're looking at a recession no matter how much speculation there is. But speculation does play a role in optimism, as well as sometimes in how prolonged these excuse me, these periods of growth or contraction go. Talk to me a little bit about speculation. What is it, and what role does it play, especially when it gets to these business owners?
Yeah, it is a very real factor. And interestingly, though people who own businesses, I mentioned, are getting a little more cautious a little further out. And we hear that not only at the small business level, but sort of all across the business sector, so the big enterprises as well, that consumer spending is still amazingly strong, that people at the individual spending level are still powering this economy. So that tells you that the individual is still very bullish on where things are. And that probably could keep the ship moving forward. So again, that consumer spending is a key metric to keep an eye on. When people at the individual level pull back and they start, not spending, then you're moving into it at that point.
So that's really what drives the market. Individuals who are in the market, consumers of the market.
So much of it, absolutely, yes.
Let me ask you this. You've been an elected official. You work with elected officials today, and that's a big part of your job, right? Where is this talk of recession coming from? Again, part of it is a reality that there is, these things are cyclical. But why is the talk so elevated? Is it in part because we're coming up to a presidential election? Or is there something they're looking at here? Is there a real fear here? Or, it could be a combination. But why is this? You're seeing it in all the presidential debates. You're seeing comedians talk about it. It's on the news. There's panels on every major news network about it. Why this much talk about it? Why now?
I think, frankly, the president is driving some of the buzz.
Sure.
And he's doing that by berating, use the straightforward word, the Federal Reserve, the federal chairman of the Federal Reserve, Powell. And I think it's because the president views his reelection as completely tied to how the economy is performing when people go to the polls in 2020. So, juicing the economy, or at least keeping it rolling, is essential to his beliefs about his political future. And Powell has, Federal Reserve Chairman Powell has taken a fairly calm approach toward it, which just infuriates the president all the more.
Sure.
I don't think he's going to, play the game, so to speak, although there has been a quarter-point interest rate cut. Could be another one. But ultimately, both the Democrats, they have, I guess, a hope that more difficult times will cause people to say, hey, we need a change.
Sure.
So both sides, the president kind of heating it up because of his concerns about where he will be next year, and the Democrats hoping to create, a negative buzz to elevate their chances. Both sides seem to be invested in kind of talking us into this recession type idea.
Gordon, you've been in office. You've run for office. You understand that side of politics. You're also a business person. You not only run FIB here in Pennsylvania, you've held different positions in privately owned businesses. Is there a concern for you when you look at that back and forth, whether it's from the president and the Trump administration or from the current Democrats who are running for president? Is there a concern for you that we're politicizing something that should probably be left unpoliticized, or something that's more serious of an issue than to simply make it a campaign talking point?
Yes, in a word, yes. I think if we're going to consider the long-term policies of our economy, that trying to juice, the economy for short periods of time through stimulus or what have you, or create negative buzz, really can do long-term damage. That really, the steady ship stability is so essential in business that some of these ups and downs really are tough for business owners to navigate. And how do you plan around something when you don't know next year? Are we really going into the nosedive, or is the president going to juice things up again? Stability, predictability are keys in business success. They really are, and business owners look for that in the policy sense. Both sides are guilty of playing some games with that.
So the volatility of the market is not a good thing when it comes to businesses, business owners, and their projections?
Typically not, unless it's really gone up. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I mean, strong periods of expansion, of course, send out positive signals to people when they get their investment statements, and they look pretty good. That can free up some cash.
Sure.
But as a general statement, slow, steady growth is what we all seek.
Yeah. To that point, there's also a group of legislators federally at the state level who are trying to put into place different parameters that would help either prevent a recession or help us guide us through one. You talked about the chairman of the Fed when you're trying to really take a calm approach to it, not really buying into the rhetoric and playing that political game, which is what he's appointed to do, or he or she is appointed to do. What's happening at the state level? I know there's some state legislators who are trying to work around, or the state government trying to really work around the issue. Mm-hmm. What are some of the different policy pieces that people try to put in place to help really draw, if you will, barricades around this?
Mm-hmm. I think the big one, which is recognized to some extent on both sides of the aisle, is that we need serious business tax reform in Pennsylvania. Highest in the nation corporate income tax rate is basically a closed for business sign on anybody who would move to Pennsylvania. Our tax structure, we're fearful, is driving young people out of our state, causing people not to start businesses.
Sure.
So business tax reform is being talked about. There are policy committees that are drafting legislation right now to go after our business tax structure, personal taxes for pass-through entities, estate taxation, and sales and use tax reform. So there are efforts to modernize Pennsylvania's taxes.
And talk to us a little bit here about how the tax side of it ultimately helps drive the question of recession and drive, for what you do, independent businesses.
Sure. Well, it all comes down to the bottom line. When the tax man bites too much of the bottom line, you say, is it worth it, me risking capital and being in this business? Should I load up the U-Haul and head for Texas or somewhere else? Ultimately, tax policy is part of the key decision people make about staying in business or closing her down and moving elsewhere.
And you look at a company like Mercedes-Benz that was in Georgia that was in New Jersey for years and years and years, upping and moving their headquarters down to Georgia. A lot because of the corporate tax side. Now, I imagine a business leaving a state like that ends up being detrimental to the economy in that state.
Absolutely, absolutely. Those were good paying jobs that went to a state that had a more friendly tax structure.
Yeah, so good information. Gordon, thank you. Don't go away. We will be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Gordon, thank you again for taking the time, for coming back. You are a favorite guest of the show, of our viewers, and just appreciate how you really can break down some otherwise very complicated market issues for us. So thank you for being here. Let's close out by really, I want to come back to the small business owner. Mm-hmm. This is what we've often called the backbone of America. This is the heart and soul of our country, of our state. That's something that Republicans say, that's something that Democrats say. Across the board, people want to do well by our small business owners and leaders. What do you tell them as they're watching the news and they're listening to the rhetoric and they're concerned about recession? What do you tell them about what's coming in the future?
Well, I think the prudent course is only believe about half of what you hear first, but for the half that you do hear that is concerning, recessions are a time of kind of, I guess you'd say, recalibrating your enterprise. And expansions are times when things can get a little bit sloppy and loose, and that's part of of things moving forward. But a recession's when you really say, let's look over our P&L here. Do we need to be in all these businesses, and are we really drawing a nice bottom line out of each one, or should we cut off these two that aren't really strong for us? Let's look over our expense list. Sure. Should we cut back a few of these things that in good times we signed up for everything? Yeah. Let's cut back on a couple. I would say make sure you have capital in place, and that's whatever lines or facilities you need, and be putting some funds in the rainy day fund, if you will, however you do that, to ride through a downturn, so that that you can come out of it strong and ready to grow again. Don't sail into one just assuming good times will be here forever, because as we've said, it's cyclical. Right. But also don't lock down too tight. So just put some reserves in place, look at the key revenue drivers, be careful about expenses, and then get ready to grow again in the future.
So you would say to a small business owner who's watching tonight that in the good times that we're having now is when you prepare for that eventual recession that comes?
I think that's the wise way, and that's the folks who ride through those downturns and come out of them and get ready to grow again. Those are the people that have made those provisions, and that's true at the personal level. In our own lives, pay off some debt, put some money in the savings account. Sort of the same things with a small business. It would be the same way. And I think this is a time to maybe be a little more cautious, take a look at the operation, and just get ready for where we're heading.
Yeah, great advice for business leaders and for individuals and families all across the country. So Gordon, thank you again for the wisdom, but also the insight into this, what I think is an incredibly important topic.
Thank you, Sam. Always good to be with you.
A pleasure is all mine. Thank you. My thanks to Representative Gordon Denlinger for joining us again and breaking down something that's on all of our minds. Are we headed toward a recession, and what do we do about it? Now, this is all the time that we have tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. Join us again next week as we break down another issue. Until then, you can continue this conversation online. Just remember to use the hashtag #FaceTheIssues. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.